The restaurant was bustling with activity as waiters weaved through the maze of tables, carrying trays loaded with steaming plates of food. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Outside, the glass walls reflected the dimming evening light, and just beyond them stood a young boy. His clothes were slightly tattered, his face pale with hunger, and his eyes fixed on the diners inside. Every bite they took seemed to echo in his mind, a reminder of the emptiness in his stomach. He hesitated by the door, shifting from one foot to the other. He clutched a small pouch in his hand, its weight far lighter than he'd hoped. He wasn't sure if it was enough to buy anything, but hunger had pushed him to try. Gathering his courage, he finally stepped inside. The warmth of the restaurant embraced him, a stark contrast to the chilly air outside. The boy approached the counter timidly, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to shoo him away. The man behind the counter, dressed in a crisp uniform, looked up and frowned. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone flat, almost dismissive. The boy cleared his throat and spoke in a soft voice, barely audible over the clamor of the restaurant. I was wondering if I could get some food. I don't have enough money, but I'm really hungry." The man's frown deepened, and he glanced over the boy's shoulder, as if hoping someone else would deal with him. "This isn't a soup kitchen," he said curtly. "If you can't pay, you can't eat." The boy's face fell, but he didn't leave. Instead, he tried again, his voice shaking slightly. "I can pay something, just not the full amount. Please, I haven't eaten all day." A few customers at nearby tables noticed the exchange and began whispering among themselves. One woman shook her head disapprovingly, while a man muttered, "Why doesn't he just go somewhere else?" The judgment in their voices cut through the boy like a knife. The man behind the counter crossed his arms. "I'm sorry, kid," he said, though his tone lacked any real sympathy. "Rules are rules." The boy nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of rejection. He turned to leave, his steps heavy with defeat. But before he could reach the door, it swung open, and a man walked in. Dressed simply and carrying an air of quiet confidence, he seemed to blend into the crowd. Yet there was something about him that made people stop and take notice. Warren Buffett had arrived. Warren paused just inside the door, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the room. The lively chatter of the restaurant softened slightly as some diners glanced his way, sensing his presence, but not quite recognizing him. His eyes quickly fell on the young boy, who was standing near the counter, his head hung low. Warren's brow furrowed slightly, and without hesitation, he walked toward the counter. The boy hadn't noticed him yet, too preoccupied with his thoughts. Warren gently tapped the counter, drawing the attention of the man behind it. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "What seems to be the problem here?" The man behind the counter straightened, glancing uneasily between Warren and the boy. "No problem," he said quickly. "This kid was just asking for food, but he doesn't have the money to pay." Warren raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but questioning. "Is that so?" he said, looking down at the boy, who was now staring at him with wide, uncertain eyes. The boy nodded hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come in here. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Warren crouched slightly to meet the boy's gaze, his tone gentle. "You're not causing any trouble," he said. "You're just hungry. That's not something to be ashamed of." The boy blinked, his lip trembling slightly as he struggled to hold back tears. Warren turned back to the man behind the counter, his polite demeanor unchanged. "Tell me," he said, Is there a rule here that says people who are hungry can't be served? The man hesitated, unsure how to respond. Well, no, but we can't just give food away for free. That's not how it works. Warren nodded slowly, as if considering the explanation. Then, with a faint smile, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He placed it on the counter. This should cover the boy's meal, he said, and while you're at it, add a little extra for anyone else who might be in need tonight. The room went silent. The diners who had been whispering moments ago now stared openly, their expressions ranging from surprise to guilt. The man behind the counter picked up the bill, his face flushing as he realized the weight of what had just happened. "Of course, sir," he stammered. "Right away." Warren turned back to the boy, smiling gently. "What would you like to eat?" The boy's eyes filled with tears as he stammered out a reply. Just anything. I don't care. Thank you. Thank you so much." Warren placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "You deserve a good meal," he said. "Now go sit down, and they'll bring it to you." The boy nodded quickly, glancing around nervously as he made his way to an empty table. The whispers in the restaurant grew louder again, but this time they were filled with curiosity and a hint of admiration. Warren turned back to the counter, his expression calm but firm. "Kindness doesn't cost much," he said quietly, but his words carried through the room like a ripple. Sometimes, all it takes is one small act to change someone's day or their life. As the boy sat at his table, a waiter nervously approached him with a steaming plate of food. The boy looked up, his eyes still wide with disbelief, and whispered a soft, "Thank you," as the plate was set in front of him. He stared at the food for a moment, almost as if he couldn't believe it was real, before taking a tentative bite. The relief and gratitude on his face were impossible to miss. Warren watched from the counter, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He wasn't looking for recognition. He was simply satisfied, knowing the boy was no longer hungry. However, the murmurs in the restaurant grew louder, and soon one of the diners, an older man in a suit, stood up and approached Warren. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone skeptical. "That was generous of you. But why would you do something like that? You don't even know the boy." Warren turned to face the man, his expression calm. "Does it matter if I know him?" he asked. "He needed help. That's reason enough." The man frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the simplicity of the answer. "But isn't it unfair to the rest of us who are paying full price? What if every hungry person walked in expecting a free meal?" Warren's smile faded slightly, and his voice grew firmer. "If every person who could afford to help did, we wouldn't have so many hungry people in the first place," he said. His words hung in the air, cutting through the tension. The boy wasn't asking for a handout. He was asking for a chance. And sometimes, that's all someone needs. The older man looked away, unable to meet Warren's steady gaze. The restaurant fell silent again, the weight of Warren's words sinking in. At that moment, the manager of the restaurant hurried out from the back, clearly alerted to the commotion. He approached Warren, his demeanor nervous, but trying to appear composed. "Sir, I heard what happened," he said. "I want to apologize for any misunderstanding. We don't normally—" Warren raised a hand to stop him. "You don't normally help people who need it?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. The manager stammered, searching for the right words. "It's just, we have policies, and policies are meant to guide us, not to excuse indifference," Warren interrupted, his voice carrying through the room. "If your policy doesn't allow for basic humanity, Then maybe it's time to change it. The manager's face turned red, but he nodded quickly. You're absolutely right, sir. We'll make adjustments. Warren stepped back, his expression softening slightly. Good, he said, because the way we treat those with the least says the most about us. He turned toward the boy, who was still eating quietly at his table. The boy looked up, catching Warren's eye, and smiled. A shy but genuine smile that carried more gratitude than words ever could. Warren walked over to him one last time, crouching down so they were eye level. You're going to be okay, he said softly. And when you're in a position to help someone else, remember this moment. The boy nodded, his voice trembling as he whispered, I will. Thank you. Warren stood, adjusted his jacket, and began to leave. As he walked toward the door, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke, but the expressions on their faces said everything. They were moved, humbled, and perhaps even inspired. Just as Warren reached the door, the boy called out, his voice ringing clear. Mister, who are you? Warren paused, turned slightly, and gave a small smile. Just someone who believes in kindness, he said simply. With that, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the restaurant and everyone inside it, forever changed. Warren walked a few steps down the street, his unassuming figure blending seamlessly into the bustling city. He didn't seek recognition or applause for what he had done. It was never about that. For him, it was about showing that small acts of kindness could ripple outward, changing perspectives and inspiring others to do the same. As Warren stepped outside, the cool evening breeze brushed against his face. The restaurant behind him was now a hive of murmurs and quiet reflection, with the boy finishing his meal and the staff exchanging glances that carried a mixture of guilt and newfound resolve. Inside the restaurant, the boy carefully folded the napkin from his table, his small hands trembling slightly. He wasn't used to this kind of attention or generosity, and it felt almost overwhelming. A waiter approached, this time with a dessert plate, and placed it gently in front of him. On the house, the waiter said with a kind smile. Enjoy. The boy looked up, his face brightening for the first time that evening. Thank you, he said softly, his voice carrying a mix of gratitude and disbelief. For a moment, it felt like the world wasn't so harsh, a moment he would carry with him long after he left the restaurant. In the corner, a diner stood up, shaking his head as if coming to terms with his earlier indifference. He walked to the counter and spoke quietly to the staff. Put $50 toward anyone who might need it tonight, he said, his voice firm. Let's make sure that kid isn't the last one we help. The gesture sparked a quiet wave of change. Another diner stood up, placing cash on the counter without a word, while a group at a table murmured about how they could do their part. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted entirely, thanks to one man's simple act of humanity. Warren, now a block away, stopped briefly to glance back at the glow of the restaurant's windows. He could imagine the conversations taking place inside and smiled faintly, knowing the seeds of change had been planted. He adjusted the bracelet on his wrist, a small keepsake from another moment like this, another life touched by kindness. For Warren, the true wealth wasn't in dollars or investments. It was in moments like these, where the world became just a little bit better, because someone cared enough to act. With that thought, he turned and continued down the street, the city lights guiding his way. Behind him, the restaurant buzzed with a warmth that hadn't been there before, its patrons and staff carrying forward the lesson of the evening. Kindness isn't just a gesture, it's a legacy.